She was a Black woman standing in a hospital hallway, holding a baby that the world told her she had to raise alone. A baby with golden skin and soft curls and eyes that told the whole truth, even when the man who gave her those eyes refused to look. He was Min Jun Park, Korean mafia boss, a man who moved through Atlanta with the cold precision of someone who had never once been wrong about anything. Or so he believed. Tailored suit, dragon tattoo climbing his neck, an empire built on silence and calculation, a man who controlled everything. Everything except the truth. The night she told him she was pregnant, he looked at her. This woman who had loved him completely, who had asked for nothing except honesty. And he said 6 words that shattered everything between them. She's not mine. He didn't ask, he didn't wait. He decided, alone, in the dark of his own shame. And he walked away from a woman who would have stayed, and a daughter who carried his eyes, his blood, and his face, and never knew her father. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have known as he built walls around his guilt, was that the truth doesn't disappear because a powerful man refuses to see it. It waits. And one photograph, sent by someone who loved them both, was about to change everything. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a member and help our channel. There are moments in a person's life that arrive without fanfare. No thunder, no warning. Just a hallway, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the distant sound of a monitor beeping somewhere down the corridor, and a woman standing still in the middle of all of it, holding a child against her chest, as though the weight of that small body was the only thing keeping her upright. Renee Caldwell had learned, somewhere in the years between nursing school and the night everything fell apart, that the body absorbs what the mind refuses to process. She had seen it in patients, the way grief settled into the shoulders, curved the spine, put shadows beneath the eyes that no amount of sleep could fix. She had documented it in charts, noted it in handoffs, whispered about it with colleagues in the break room. And now she understood it from the inside, because she was carrying it herself, and had been carrying it for 6 months. And the weight had become so familiar, she sometimes forgot it was there until something small, a song, a smell, the particular angle of afternoon light through a hospital window, brought it roaring back. Hana was 6 months old. She slept now against Renee's shoulder, one small fist curled beneath her chin, lips slightly parted, her breath warm and even. She was, by any measure, a perfect child. Round cheeks the color of warm honey, soft curls that spiraled away from her temples in a dozen different directions every morning, impossible to tame, inexplicably beautiful. And her eyes? When she opened them, which she would in a moment, roused by the change in light as Renee turned toward the window, her eyes were the kind of thing that stopped people in their tracks. Almond-shaped, deeply set, with a fold at the inner corner so precise, so specifically architectural, that anyone who had ever looked closely at Min Jun Park would have recognized it immediately. Renee had recognized it. She had recognized it from the first week, and it had broken her heart in a way she didn't have the language for. Because how do you grieve the fact that your daughter carries the face of the man who looked at her and said she wasn't his? She turned from the window. The hallway stretched before her, empty for a moment, the way hospital hallways sometimes go quiet between the storms of need. She had 40 minutes before her next shift began. She had come in early not because she needed the overtime, though she did, but because the apartment felt too large in the mornings, too quiet in the particular way that empty spaces feel when you are used to a presence that is no longer there. It was better to be here, where the sounds were clinical and purposeful, where there was always something that needed doing, where she could press her competence against the day like a shield. She had been doing that for 6 months. She intended to keep doing it indefinitely. What Renee did not know, could not have known, standing there in that hallway with her daughter sleeping against her shoulder, was that 1,800 miles away, in a hotel room in Las Vegas, where Minjun Park had spent the last 4 days attending a conference he had manufactured excuses to attend, her name had appeared on a screen he was staring at. Not a message, not a call. A photograph, sent without warning by his younger sister, Daun, who had always loved Renee and had never forgiven her brother for what he'd done, even if she had never said so directly to his face. The photograph was simple. It showed a baby lying on a cream-colored blanket, arms stretched wide in that particular pose of infant abandon, face turned slightly toward the light. And her eyes were open. And even in the photograph, even reduced to pixels on a phone screen, even without the warmth and dimension of real life, they were unmistakably, undeniably his. Minjun Park had stared at that photograph for 11 minutes without moving. He knew this because the screen had gone dark twice, and he had unlocked it again, needing to look, needing to confirm what he was seeing, needing to understand why the shape of those eyes was tearing something open in his chest that he had spent 6 months carefully, methodically sealing shut. He was not a man who unraveled. He had built an entire identity on the opposite principle. He was Minjun Park. He was 36 years old. He had built something from almost nothing, had taken the infrastructure of his father's small import operation and transformed it into something that moved across 4 states and generated numbers that his accountants sometimes had to explain to him twice. Not because he didn't understand finance, but because even he occasionally found the scale of it difficult to absorb. He had done all of this with patience and precision, and the particular kind of cold clarity that comes from learning very young that emotion is a liability. He had learned that lesson in Seoul at 14, watching his father lose everything in a week because he had trusted someone he loved. He had carried that lesson to Atlanta, had repeated it to himself like a scripture, had built it into the architecture of every decision he made. And for 22 years, it had served him. Until Renee. She had arrived in his life at an angle he hadn't anticipated. He had attended that health conference as a public relations gesture. His legal team had suggested more visible philanthropy, something to soften the profile. And a significant donation to community health clinics had seemed clean and manageable. He had not expected to sit down next to a woman in navy scrubs who was eating a granola bar with the focused efficiency of someone who had exactly 12 minutes for lunch, who had glanced at him once, assessed him completely, and returned to her granola bar without visible interest. He had found this, to his own bewilderment, captivating. He had introduced himself. She had been polite but unimpressed. He had offered to buy her coffee. She had pointed out that the conference was providing free coffee 20 feet away. He had laughed, genuinely, spontaneously, in a way he almost didn't recognize. And she had looked at him with slightly raised eyebrows, as if recalculating, and said, "Okay, 1 coffee, 20 minutes. He had stayed for 3 hours. She had let him. That was 2.5 years before the hallway. Before Hannah. Before the 6 words that had ended everything. The relationship that grew between them was not the kind that announces itself loudly. It was quiet and specific and built on small things. The way she argued with him about policy and never backed down when he pushed back. The way she fell asleep watching documentaries and woke up knowing exactly where the narrator had left off. The way she looked at him sometimes, in unguarded moments, as if she was trying to see past the version of himself he showed the world, and finding that she could. He had told her things he had told no one. Not all things. There were rooms in him that remained locked, but more than he had intended to share with anyone. More than was safe. He had known, somewhere beneath the precision of his thinking, that this was dangerous. He had known, and he had continued anyway, because for the first time in 22 years, something felt more important than the principle his father's ruin had taught him. And then the diagnosis. He had gone to the doctor for something unrelated. A routine check, the kind his physician nagged him about annually. The results had come back with a footnote, a genetic marker, something the doctor had explained in careful, measured language that Min-jun had translated, in the silence of his own head, into a single, devastating sentence. You may not be able to father children. The probability, the doctor said, was low but significant. The condition was manageable but permanent. Min-jun had sat in that office and heard nothing after that sentence. He had nodded at appropriate intervals. He had taken the information packet the doctor extended toward him. He had driven home alone, in the particular silence of a man who has just been told that something he did not know he wanted has been taken from him. He had said nothing to Renee. Not that day. Not the following week, when she had called twice and he had answered briefly, with excuses. Not the week after, when he had disappeared entirely, going north to New York on business that could have waited, telling himself he needed time to think. Knowing the truth was that he did not know how to tell her something that made him feel, for the first time in his adult life, like less. He had not told her because telling her would have required him to admit that the diagnosis had shaken something fundamental in his sense of himself. And Min-jun Park did not admit to being shaken. So when he returned, 3 weeks later, and she had met him at the door with eyes that said she had rehearsed this conversation and news that rearranged everything. When she had taken his hand and told him, carefully, with the particular precision of a woman who has thought very hard about how to say a thing. When she had said she was pregnant. He had heard it through the filter of everything he had not told her. And the math he did, in the silence that followed, was the wrong math. It was the math of a man who had been told he probably couldn't, who had taken probably and made it certainly, who had taken a medical footnote and built a verdict from it. It was the math of a man who was afraid and ashamed and too proud to say either of those things out loud. She's not mine, he had said. 6 words. Quiet. Certain. Final. And little did he know, could not have known, standing there in the doorway of the life he was dismantling with his own hands, that he was about to spend the next 6 months living inside the most catastrophic miscalculation of his life. Not a business error, not a strategic failure. Something far simpler and far more devastating than that. He had looked at the truth and called it a lie. And in a hotel room in Las Vegas, staring at a photograph of a baby's eyes, the first crack appeared in everything he had so carefully built to keep that truth out. The crack did not widen immediately. That was not how it worked with men like Min-jun Park. With men like him, the crack appeared, was noted, was filed away behind the eyes where no one could see it, and the surface was smoothed back over with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent decades maintaining a facade that the world had come to accept as the actual face. He pocketed the phone. He stood up from the edge of the hotel bed. He walked to the window and looked out over the Las Vegas skyline, all that manufactured light against the desert dark. All that noise designed to convince people that something meaningful was happening. And he breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth, the way his grandfather had taught him to do when he was 7 years old and had scraped his knee badly enough to warrant tears. His grandfather had said, "You feel it, and then you put it somewhere, and then you move." He had been doing that for 29 years. He told himself he was doing it now. He ordered room service he did not eat. He attended the final conference session the next morning with his expression arranged in its customary configuration, attentive, measured, slightly remote in the way that powerful people often are, as though their thoughts are perpetually occupied with something more important than the room they are currently in. His associates noticed nothing. His attorney, who had flown in for the afternoon meetings, remarked that he seemed quiet, and Min Jun said he had not slept well, which was true, and the subject was closed. He flew back to Atlanta on a Thursday evening, and by Friday morning, he was in the office above the bistro, working through the week's numbers with the same focused attention he brought to everything. The office was clean and spare, a desk of pale ash wood, 2 chairs for visitors, a single painting on the wall that his mother had chosen, a landscape of the coast near Busan where she had grown up. He had never been particularly sentimental about the painting. He kept it because she had chosen it, and because in the years since she had passed, keeping the things she had chosen felt like the closest thing to a conversation he could still have with her. He did not look at his phone. He did not open Daeun's message again. He told himself this was because he had processed it sufficiently and reached no new conclusions, which was the kind of thing he was very good at telling himself. What he was less good at, what he had never been good at, though he would not have admitted this to anyone, was sitting still with something unresolved. He could defer. He could postpone. He could build elaborate structures of productivity around the thing he was not dealing with, and work inside those structures with genuine focus, and convince himself that the deferral was a choice rather than an avoidance. He had been doing this with the question of Hana for 6 months. He had been doing it with particular intensity for the 4 days since Daeun's photograph had arrived. And he was still doing it on Friday morning. And he was still doing it Friday afternoon. And it was not until Friday evening, when the bistro below him filled with the sounds of dinner service and the smell of doenjang jjigae drifted up through the vents and caught him completely off guard with a memory. Renee sitting across from him at that same table downstairs, the first time he had cooked for her, laughing at something he had said, her head tipped back, completely unguarded. That the structure collapsed. He sat at his desk for a long time afterward. Not working, just sitting. Little did the staff moving through the bistro below know that the man in the office above them, the man they regarded with a mixture of respect and careful distance, was sitting in the dark with his hands flat on the desk in front of him, doing the thing he had not allowed himself to do in 6 months, actually thinking about Renee Caldwell. Not the version of her he had constructed after the fact, the version that made his decision make sense, the version where her announcement had been a betrayal and his response had been a necessary correction. The real version. The one who had eaten a granola bar with focused efficiency and let him stay for 3 hours. The one who had argued with him about healthcare policy at 11 o'clock at night, lying on her stomach across his bed with her laptop open, refusing to concede a point she believed in, even when he could see that she knew it would go easier if she did. The one who had told him, very quietly, on the night they had talked about his father for the first time, that she thought he carried other people's failures as though they were his own, and that she wanted him to stop. He had said, "I don't know how." She had said, "I know. I'm not asking you to know how." I'm just asking you to know that I see it. No one had ever said that to him. He had not known what to do with it. He had filed it away behind his eyes, in the place where things went that he didn't know how to process. And he had said something deflecting, and she had let him. And they had both understood that something real had just happened in the space between the deflection and the letting go. He had been in love with her. He understood this now, in the dark office above the bistro, with more clarity than he had allowed himself since the night he had sent her away. He had been in love with her, and he had been afraid of it. And when the moment came, when the pregnancy arrived and the diagnosis told him what he had already convinced himself was true, he had used the fear and the shame as weapons against the love. Because destroying the thing was easier than admitting he didn't know how to keep it. He picked up his phone. He sat with it for a very long time. He did not call her. He was not ready for what her voice would do to him. He was not ready for the silence that would follow if she didn't answer. He was not ready for the particular kind of pain that comes from hearing someone speak to you and the tone they use for people they have finished grieving. He had heard that tone in his own voice often enough to know what it felt like from the outside. And he was not ready. What he did instead was call Daoun. She answered on the second ring, which meant she had been expecting him, or at least hoping. She said his name in the particular way she'd had since she was a child, flattening the syllable slightly so it came out softer than the formal pronunciation. And the familiarity of it did something to him that he was barely able to contain. "Why did you send that?" he said. "Because you needed to see it." "Daoun." "Oppa." Her voice was quiet, but not gentle. It had an edge to it that she had not always possessed, that she had grown into over the past 6 months. An edge that told him she had been angry at him for a long time and had decided, apparently, that the time for softness was over. "I watched what you did to her. I was there when she came to pick up her things, and she didn't cry. Not once. Not in front of me. And I know what that means. That doesn't mean it didn't break her. That means she was too dignified to fall apart in your apartment." He said nothing. "The baby has your eyes," Daoun said. "She has your eyes and grandmother's nose, and the way she holds her hands when she's thinking about something, she holds them exactly the way you do. I noticed it when she was 3 weeks old, and I didn't say anything because I didn't know what to say. But I'm saying it now because someone has to. The doctor told me. I know what the doctor told you. You told me at the time. I also know that you took one piece of information and turned it into a certainty, and used that certainty to hurt someone who never hurt you." A pause. Then, more quietly, "You were scared. I understand that. But Renee didn't do anything wrong. And Hannah is 6 months old, and she doesn't have a father. And you are sitting in that office right now, not talking to anyone and telling yourself you're thinking, when really you're just waiting for a way to feel less terrible that doesn't require you to do anything hard." The accuracy of this was so precise that it landed like a physical thing. "What do you want me to do?" he said. And he heard, to his own humiliation, that his voice had changed, that something beneath the control had shifted. "I want you to find out the truth," she said. "Actually find out, not assume, not calculate. Do the test. And then figure out what you owe to that little girl and to Renee, and maybe even to yourself. And do it. Whatever it is, just do it." She hung up before he could respond. He sat in the dark for a long time. Below him, the bistro sounds continued. The clean percussion of plates, the low murmur of conversations, someone laughing near the bar. The ordinary sounds of a world proceeding without regard for the fact that something was quietly coming undone above it. The next morning, he drove to the hospital. He had not planned a speech. He had not prepared an approach. He had, in fact, spent the entire drive telling himself he would simply park, sit in the car, determine whether the impulse was genuine or reactive, and drive away if necessary. This was the kind of procedural self-permission he had always given himself, the illusion of an exit as a precondition for taking the step. He parked. He sat in the car for 4 minutes. Then he got out. The hospital lobby was bright and purposeful in the way that hospitals always are in the mornings. The particular choreography of shift changes, the clusters of scrubs moving with direction, the visitors who were already here so early because they had nowhere else to be. He stood near the reception desk, and he was aware, with uncomfortable clarity, of how strange he looked here. The terse suit, the neck tattoo visible above his collar. The way people glanced at him once and then recalibrated their assumptions. He had always moved through spaces like this, spaces with different rules, different codes, with the careful self-possession of someone who understood that visibility was a vulnerability. Today, he stood there anyway. He asked for Renee Caldwell. The receptionist looked at him with the polite skepticism of someone trained to manage difficult people gently and said she would let the floor know. He found a seat. He sat in it. He waited. He waited for 3 hours and 12 minutes. He knew this because he had stopped looking at his phone, stopped giving himself access to the procedural world of messages and updates and the perpetual forward motion of business, and had instead sat with the waiting itself, which was its own kind of discipline. People came and went. A child across the waiting room fell asleep against her grandmother's arm. A man in his 60s sat with his hands clasped and his eyes on the middle distance, doing the particular calculations of someone waiting on news that might not be good. Min-jun watched all of it. He did not reach for his phone. And then the elevator opened, and Renee walked out. She was in her scrubs, the navy blue ones that she always wore on her long shifts, and she had Hana in a carrier against her chest. The baby awake now, head tilted to the side, those eyes open and moving with the particular focused curiosity of infants who are beginning to understand that the world contains more information than they have yet catalogued. Renee was speaking to a colleague as she came through the elevator doors, nodding at something the other woman was saying, her professional composure complete and settled around her like a second skin. And then she saw him. The composure didn't break. That was the first thing he noticed. It shifted. Some small internal rearrangement that only showed at the edges, in the slight straightening of her spine, the way her hand moved to rest against Hana's back in a gesture that was both protective and steadying, as if she were drawing something from the contact. She said something brief to her colleague. The colleague looked toward Min-jun, looked back at Renee, squeezed her arm once, and walked away. And then there were 10 feet of hospital corridor between them, and nothing else. Renee looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice that was quiet and level and contained every month of the past 6 months inside it like sediment, "You have a lot of nerve." And Min-jun Park, who had built an empire on the principle that he was always the most certain person in the room, had no answer for that. Because she was right. And they both knew it. And Hana, between them in the carrier, turned her head toward his voice when he had said nothing at all. Just the sound of his breath. Just the particular frequency of his presence in the air. and looked at him with eyes that were unmistakably exactly like his own. She did not invite him to sit down. She did not soften. She stood in that corridor with 10 feet between them, and her hand pressed flat against Hana's back, and she waited. Because she had learned it the hard way in the months since he had said those 6 words and closed the door behind him, that she did not owe anyone her comfort. Not even him. Especially not him. Minjun took 1 step forward. Just 1. As though testing the weight of the ground between them. "I need to talk to you," he said. "I gathered that," Renee said. "You've been sitting in my waiting room for 3 hours. You knew I was here. The receptionist told me 20 minutes after you arrived." She held his gaze without effort. "I finished what I was doing first." This, too, landed with precision. He had come here expecting... what exactly? He had not let himself construct an expectation, because expectation was the first step toward a particular kind of vulnerability he had spent his life avoiding. But beneath the careful blankness he had maintained for 3 hours in that waiting room, something had assumed she would be shaken to see him. Something had assumed, in the arrogant and unexamined way that certain kinds of men assume things about the women they have hurt, that his presence would constitute an event in her life, a disruption, something that would require her to gather herself. And instead, she had finished what she was doing first, and arrived composed, and was looking at him now the way she had always looked at him when she had already decided something, and was simply waiting for him to catch up. "I saw the photograph," he said. "Thaun sent me. I know what Thaun sent you." A pause. "She told me she was going to." He had not known that. The small recalibration this required, the understanding that the conversation he had imagined arriving at alone, with the photograph as a revelation, had already been anticipated, had already been discussed between 2 women who were apparently in more communication than he had realized, moved through him quietly. "Then you know why I'm here," he said. "I know why you think you're here," Renee said. "I'm not sure those are the same thing." A nurse passed between them with a cart, nodding at Renee, not registering Minjun as anything requiring acknowledgement. The corridor returned to its specific quiet. Hana made a small sound. Not distress, something between waking and settling. And Renee shifted her weight, a rocking motion so practiced it was nearly invisible. And the baby stilled. Minjun watched this. He watched the efficiency and the tenderness of it, the way Renee held the child's weight with her whole body rather than just her arms. The way the rocking was not a performance of motherhood, but simply motherhood itself, unremarkable to her now because it had become the texture of her daily life. He had missed 6 months of it. He had missed 6 months of Hana existing in the world, and the understanding of this arrived not as abstraction, but as something physical and specific. A loss with actual weight. "I want to do the test," he said. Renee was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why?" "Because I need to know. You need to know," she repeated. Not angry. Precise. "Minjun, I know. I was there. I know who the father of my child is. I have known since before she was born. The question of whether you need to know is a different question from whether the answer is going to change anything. It changes everything." "Does it?" She tilted her head slightly. That gesture he remembered, the one that meant she was about to say something she had already thought through carefully and was only now choosing to deploy. "Because from where I'm standing, what changes things is not a test result. A test result is just a number on a page. What changes things is what you do with it. And I have watched you make decisions based on information before. And I have watched what that looks like. And I am not going to let my daughter be on the receiving end of another one of your conclusions until I understand what you actually came here to say. The words were even. They were not raised. They were, in their very calmness, more devastating than anything shouted. Little did Minjun know, standing there in that corridor absorbing the full and measured weight of what she had said, that this moment, this specific exchange, this 10 feet of institutional tile between them, was the moment that would define every moment that came after it. Not the test, not the result. This. Whether he could stand inside the truth of what she was saying and not deflect, not manage, not reach for the procedural response that had always saved him from the actual conversation. He said, "I was told I couldn't have children." The corridor did not change. The lights did not shift. Hana made another small sound and settled again. But something moved across Renee's face. Not softening, not yet, but a recalibration. A taking in of new information the way a precise mind takes in new information. Absorbing it, holding it, not yet deciding what it means. "Tell me," she said. And he told her. Standing in that corridor, without the desk between them, without the terse suit and the controlled expression doing their usual work. He told her about the appointment and the genetic marker, and the doctor's careful language, and what he had done with that language inside his own head, alone, in the silence of his car in the parking garage below the medical building. He told her about the 3 weeks he had been absent, and what he had been doing in those 3 weeks, which was not business, which had never been business, but rather the elaborate avoidance of a conversation he did not know how to begin, because beginning it would have required him to say out loud that he was afraid of being less than she deserved. He told her this, and it cost him something. She could see it costing him. That was not nothing. But Renee Caldwell had also spent 6 months building something. Not a wall, exactly. Walls were static, and what she had built was more like a practiced equilibrium, a way of holding herself that accounted for pain without being governed by it. She had built it in the apartment, in the early mornings when Hana was awake and crying, and there was no one else there. She had built it on the nights her mother had sat with the baby, so she could cry in the shower with the water running loud enough that no one would hear. She had built it in the hospital corridors, and the break room, and the drive home, and the long stretch of every evening that she navigated alone. And it had become real and structural and load-bearing. And she was not going to dismantle it for a confession in a hallway, no matter how much it cost him to make it. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. "When you got the diagnosis. Why didn't you just tell me?" He was quiet for a moment, then, "Because I didn't know what you would do with it." "I would have stayed," she said immediately. And then, quieter, "I would have stayed, Minjun. That's what you didn't let me do." The silence that followed this was the particular silence of an irreversible thing being understood. Not accepted. Understanding and acceptance are different architectures, but understood. He had made a calculation about what she would do, and the calculation had been wrong, and the wrongness of it had cost both of them everything. And now they were standing on the other side of that cost, looking at each other across the rubble. Hana chose this moment to open her eyes fully. She had been drifting in the carrier, lulled by the vibration of voices, and now something, some change in the air, some shift in the quality of the silence, brought her out of it. She turned her head with the deliberate, effortful motion of a 6-month-old achieving focus, and she looked at Minjun. He looked back at her. The eyes were his. This was not a projection or a hope or a thing he was choosing to see because he wanted it to be there. They were his in the specific way that certain genetic expressions are undeniable. Not just the shape, though the shape was unmistakable, that deep-set almond with the precise epicanthic fold that the Park family called, with the casual pride of people who do not question their own distinctiveness, the family mark. It was also the quality of attention behind them. The way she was looking at him was the way he looked at things he was trying to understand. The particular focused intentness of a mind that does not glance, but examines. He had never believed in the things people said about recognizing blood. He had always thought it was sentiment masquerading as intuition. He believed it now. Standing in that corridor, looking at a 6-month-old child who was looking back at him with his own eyes and his own attention and something in her expression that was entirely her own and entirely new. He believed it with a completeness that left no room for the architecture of doubt he had spent 6 months constructing. "Her name is Hannah," Renee said. Her voice had shifted, fractionally, but he heard it, because he had always heard the things that moved in the frequencies beneath what she said. There was something in the way she said it that was not a concession, but was perhaps the opening of a door, narrow and provisional, not an invitation, but not a refusal either. "Hannah," he repeated. The baby turned toward his voice. Just slightly. Just enough. Something happened in Minjin Park's chest that he had no existing vocabulary for. He had experienced many things in 36 years. Ambition, loss, anger, the particular cold satisfaction of having outmaneuvered someone who thought themselves untouchable. But this was different from all of those. This was something arriving rather than something achieved. Something given rather than taken. And he had so little practice with that mode of experience that for a moment, he simply did not know what to do with his own face. He looked up from Hannah to Renee. Renee was watching him with the eyes of a woman who had already done her grieving and was now doing something harder, which was deciding. Not forgiving. She was not there, and she might not get there, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But deciding. Weighing the man in front of her against the man who had said those 6 words. Trying to determine whether there was enough distance between those 2 versions to make the next step possible. "I want the test," he said again. But it was different now. The same words carrying different weight. Not the words of a man demanding proof, but the words of a man asking for the chance to make the proof official. To have a number on a page that would allow the world, and himself, and her, to name what his eyes had already confirmed. Renee looked at him for a long moment. "I'll think about it," she said. It was not a yes. He knew better than to receive it as one. But it was not a no either. And a no was what he had deserved, and they both understood that the gap between what he deserved and what she was offering was a measure of something. Her generosity, her pragmatism, the fact that Hannah existed in the world and would one day ask questions that deserved answers. He nodded. Once. "I'm still in the building on Peachtree," he said. "The same number." "I know where you are," she said. Of course she did. He nodded again. He looked at Hannah one more time. Those eyes, still tracking him with their precise and unhurried attention. And then he turned and walked back toward the elevator, because staying longer would have been asking for more than she had offered. And for once in his life, he was going to take exactly what was given, and not reach for the rest. He was halfway across the lobby when he heard her voice behind him. Not calling. She did not raise her voice, had never raised it, not once in 2.5 years. But carrying, in the particular way that some voices carry without effort. Minjun. He stopped, turned. She was standing where he had left her, Hana in the carrier against her chest, one hand still resting on the baby's back. Her expression was not warm. It was not cold either. It was the expression of a woman who has made a decision she is not entirely certain about and has made it anyway. Because certainty is a luxury that responsible people cannot always afford. The DNA clinic on Piedmont, she said. Saturday morning, 9 o'clock. She did not wait for his response. She turned and walked back toward the elevator, and the doors opened as though the building itself had been waiting for her, and she stepped in, and they closed behind her. Minjun stood in the lobby for a moment after she was gone. Around him, the hospital continued its ordinary choreography, indifferent to the fact that something had just shifted in the life of the man standing near the reception desk in the ash suit. Something tectonic and irreversible. The kind of shift that does not announce itself, but that changes the coordinates of everything that follows. He walked out into the Atlanta morning. The light was the particular gold of early autumn, the kind of light that makes the city look briefly like a more beautiful version of itself. He stood on the sidewalk and breathed it in. Saturday, 9 o'clock. He had not expected that. He had not deserved it. And he was aware, with a clarity that felt new and uncomfortable and necessary, that the distance between what he deserved and what he had been given was not a debt to be quietly absorbed and moved past. It was a measure of something he owed. Not to her, or not only to her, but to the child who had looked at him with his own eyes and not looked away. He started walking toward his car. He did not reach for his phone. He did not reach for the procedural world of things to manage and decisions to make and problems to solve. He walked in the autumn light with something sitting in his chest that he did not yet have the word for, that was made of equal parts grief and something that might eventually become gratitude. He did not know, on that Atlanta sidewalk, what Saturday would bring. He did not know what the number on the page would do to the architecture of everything he had built in the months since he had been wrong. He did not know whether Renee would ever look at him with anything other than the careful, load-bearing composure she had worn in that corridor. But he knew about the eyes. He had always known, if he was honest. And honesty, he was beginning to understand, was the one discipline he had never actually mastered. Saturday was 4 days away. For the first time in 6 months, Minjun Park had something to wait for that was not a number on a balance sheet or a meeting with consequences. Something that could not be managed or anticipated or controlled. Something that simply had to be arrived at, with whatever he was able to bring. He got in the car. He drove home. He did not call his attorney. He did not call his operations manager. He sat in the car in the underground garage for 3 minutes after he turned off the engine, in the quiet, and he let himself feel the full weight of what was coming without putting it anywhere. His grandfather had said, "You feel it, and then you put it somewhere, and then you move." For once, he was only going to do the first part. Saturday arrived the way significant days sometimes do, without the ceremony they deserve, dressed in the ordinary clothes of any other morning. The sky over Atlanta was low and gray, not threatening rain exactly, but holding it in reserve, the kind of sky that makes the city look provisional, as though the light has not yet committed to the day. Minjun was awake before 5. He had slept in pieces, waking at intervals and lying in the dark of the penthouse bedroom with the particular alertness of a man whose mind has decided that rest is a lower priority than rehearsal. cycling through versions of what the morning might bring until the versions blurred together and became indistinguishable from each other. He was at the clinic on Piedmont at 8:43. He sat in his car and watched the entrance and told himself he was not watching for her. And then she arrived at 8:57 in a gray coat he did not recognize. She had bought it after then, bought it in the life she had been building without him, with Hannah in a car seat carrier, and the sight of them moving across the parking lot together, Renee's stride purposeful and measured, even with the added weight and complexity of the carrier, did something to his chest that made the rehearsed versions of the morning dissolve entirely. He got out of the car. She saw him. She nodded once. Not warmth, not coldness. The nod of a woman who has decided on a pragmatic neutrality and intends to maintain it. And they walked into the clinic together, without touching, with 12 inches of autumn air between them that felt, to Minjun, like a geography with its own weather. The clinic was clean and quiet, the way medical spaces are quiet on Saturday mornings, when the urgent cases have gone elsewhere and what remains are the appointments that required the particular courage of a scheduled decision. A technician took them through the process with the brisk compassion of someone who had done this many times and understood that the people sitting across from her were rarely there for simple reasons. A cheek swab from Minjun, a cheek swab from Hannah, who submitted to this indignity with the focused disapproval of a 6-month-old being asked to cooperate with something she had not agreed to, and then forgot about it entirely when Renee produced a soft cloth toy from the bag and handed it over. The results, the technician explained, would be available within 48 hours via a secure portal. They walked out into the gray morning. At the edge of the parking lot, where their paths divided towards separate cars, Renee stopped. She adjusted the carrier against her chest. She looked at him with the expression he had come to understand was not composure exactly, but the thing that composure is built on top of. Something older and quieter. The bedrock of a person who has decided what they are made of, and has stopped negotiating with anyone who wants to tell them differently. 48 hours, she said. Yes, he said. And then what? He had thought about this. He had thought about almost nothing else for 4 days. He said, then I want to be honest with you about all of it. The diagnosis, what I did with it, what I should have done instead. Not to ask for anything, just because you deserve to hear it said properly. Not in a hospital corridor. She was quiet for a moment. Hannah was batting at the cloth toy with the serious concentration of someone engaged in important research. I'll think about it, Renee said, for the second time. And he understood, as he had the first time, that this was not a deflection, that thinking about it was the actual answer, that she was not going to perform a certainty she did not have, and that this, too, was a form of the honesty he had told her she deserved. He nodded. She turned and walked to her car. He watched her go, and then he went to his, and he sat in it for a while before starting the engine, doing the first part of what his grandfather had taught him, and, for once, not rushing to the second. The 48 hours passed with the specific slowness of time that is being monitored. Minjun worked. He ate. He slept in pieces again. He called Daun on Sunday evening, and she answered and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "How did it go?" And he said, "We did the test." And she said, "Good." And he said, "She looked at me in the parking lot," meaning Hannah. And Daun said very quietly, "I know. That's why I sent you the picture." He did not have an answer for this, and she did not require one. And they stayed on the phone for a while in the particular silence of two people who have said the important things and are simply keeping each other company in what comes after. The portal notification arrived Monday morning at 7:14. He was already awake. He was already dressed. He was sitting at the pale ash desk with a coffee that had gone cold beside him. And when the notification appeared on his phone, he looked at it for a long time without opening it, because there was a version of this moment. A version where the number on the page said something other than what his eyes and his chest and Downs' voice and every piece of intelligence he actually trusted had already told him. And he needed a moment to decide whether he was the kind of man who could receive that version with integrity. He decided he was, or that he was going to try to be. He opened the portal. Probability of paternity, 99.998%. He read it twice. Not because there was ambiguity, there was none, but because the number deserved to be looked at properly, deserved the full weight of his attention, deserved to be received rather than processed. He was Hannah's father. He had been Hannah's father since before she was born, since the moment of her beginning. And he had spent 6 months on the other side of a door he had closed with his own hands, and the number on the screen was not a revelation so much as a confirmation of what the cost of that had been. There was a note at the bottom of the report, a brief addendum from the reviewing geneticist, flagged as relevant to the case. He read it again. Then he set the phone down on the desk and sat very still. The note explained that the genetic condition he had been diagnosed with, the condition that had been described to him as making paternity nearly impossible, had been assessed using a diagnostic framework that had since been revised. The revised framework, updated in the clinical literature 18 months ago, reclassified the condition in question as a significant but not prohibitive factor in fertility. The earlier language, which had been standard at the time of his diagnosis, had overstated the reproductive implications. In plain terms, the doctor who had spoken to him had used the best language available to him at that moment, and that language had been imprecise, and the imprecision had cost more than any of the people involved in that original appointment could have anticipated. A medical footnote, a reclassification in a clinical journal, a single paragraph of updated language that, arriving 18 months earlier, might have changed everything. Minjun Park sat at his pale ash desk and looked at his mother's painting. The coast near Busan, the particular blue of the water there, the small figures on the rocks that she had always said represented ordinary people living ordinary lives and finding them sufficient. And he understood, with a completeness that left no room for bargaining, that he had destroyed something real and irreplaceable because he had taken a piece of information, accepted it without question, and built a verdict from it in secret, alone, without giving the person most affected by it any opportunity to respond. He had done to Renee exactly what his father had done to their family. He had decided, in the privacy of his own fear, what the truth was. He had not checked. He had not asked. He had not said in the simplest possible language, "I am afraid, and here is what I have been told, and I need you to help me understand what it means." He had done none of those things. He had simply decided, and acted on the decision, and left her to absorb the consequences of a choice she had not been invited to participate in. The irony of this, that a man who had built everything on the principle of not repeating his father's mistake had repeated it in the most fundamental way, not through trust betrayed, but through truth withheld, arrived not as a revelation, but as a weight, quiet and total. The kind of understanding that does not spark or flash, but simply settles, the way sediment settles, the way the ground absorbs rain. He picked up the phone. He called Renee. She answered on the 4th ring. He heard in the background the small sounds of a morning in progress. Water running, a drawer closing, Hana making the low, contemplative sounds she apparently made while conducting her morning research into the nature of things. "I got the results," he said. "So did I," she said. "They send them to both parties." Of course they did. He had not thought of this. She had been looking at the same number since... He checked the timestamp. 7:14. The same 48 hours. The same morning. "The geneticist's note," he said. I read it. A pause. He could hear her breathing. He could hear Hana in the background, the small, serious sounds of her. "Renee," he said, and then he stopped, because the sentence he had prepared, the honest and complete version of everything he should have said 6 months ago, the one he had been composing for 4 days in the gaps between sleep, did not feel like enough. Not because it wasn't true, because the truth of it was so large and so overdue that any sentence he built from it would arrive smaller than what it was trying to carry. "I know," she said, quietly. Not forgiving. He heard the distinction, had trained himself to hear it. Not forgiving. Knowing. Which was different and more complicated, and in this moment more than he had any right to expect. "I want to be in her life," he said. "Whatever that looks like. Whatever you decide that looks like. I'm not asking for what I had before. I'm not asking for anything I haven't earned. I just..." She looked at me, Renee. In the hospital. She looked at me and He stopped. "I know," Renee said again. And this time there was something beneath the words. Not warmth yet, not the warmth he remembered, but the distant precondition of warmth. The state of a thing that has not been destroyed and might, given sufficient time and sufficient evidence, become something livable. "Can I see her?" he said. The pause that followed this was the longest pause of his adult life. Longer than the wait in the hospital waiting room. Longer than the 48 hours of the portal. It was the pause of a woman doing the hardest kind of arithmetic. Not numbers, but people. Not probability, but trust. Weighing a man's stated intentions against his demonstrated history, and finding a path between what he had been and what he might be allowed to become, for the sake of a child who deserved a father, and a mother who had decided that her own dignity was not negotiable, and that both of those things could be true at the same time. "Sunday," Renee said. 1 hour. My mother will be there." He almost said, "Thank you." He stopped himself, because thank you was not enough and also too easy. The kind of phrase that lets the person saying it feel they have acknowledged something, when what they have actually done is found the quickest available exit from the weight of it. Instead, he said, "Sunday. I'll be there." "Minjun." Her voice changed slightly. Not softer exactly, but different, carrying something she was choosing to say in spite of the cost of saying it. "Whatever happens from here, whatever we figure out about Hana, about what this looks like, I need you to understand something." "Tell me," he said. "I'm not doing this for you," she said. "I'm not doing this because of the test result, or the note, or the diagnosis. I'm doing this because Hana is going to grow up, and she is going to look in a mirror, and she is going to see something that comes from both of us, and she is going to want to understand where she comes from. All of where she comes from. And I refuse to let my anger at you, which is real and which is not finished, be the reason she doesn't get to know that." She said it the way she said everything important. Evenly, without performance, with the particular precision of a person who has thought carefully about what they mean and means exactly what they say. "I understand," he said. "I don't think you do yet," she said. but I think you're going to try. And right now, that's what I have to work with." She ended the call. He sat at his desk with the phone in his hand and his mother's painting on the wall and the cold coffee beside him and the morning light coming through the windows at the angle that meant the city was deciding, finally, to commit to the day. He thought about Hannah. He thought about the way she had looked at him in the hospital corridor. The focused and unhurried attention of those eyes. His eyes. The family mark. The thing he had looked at in a photograph and recognized before he was ready to recognize it. He thought about what it meant to be given something you had forfeited and had no right to request back, and what you owed to the person who gave it anyway. Not in gratitude. Gratitude was too simple, too self-serving. But in the steady and unglamorous work of becoming someone worthy of the gift. He was not there yet. He knew this. The knowing was not comfortable. He intended to sit in the discomfort rather than manage it. To let it do what it was supposed to do, which was change something permanent in the architecture of how he made decisions about the people he loved. Sunday came. He arrived at Renee's apartment building at exactly the agreed time. Not early, which would have been presumptuous, not late, which would have been disrespectful. He rang the bell. He waited. He heard footsteps, and then Renee's mother, a small, direct woman who looked at him for a long moment with the eyes of a person who has heard everything and is making her own assessment independent of whatever conclusions others have reached, opened the door and looked at him and said, without preamble, "You hurt my daughter." "Yes," he said. "I did." She studied him for another moment. Then she stepped aside. He walked in. The apartment was warm and lived in, the particular warmth of a space that has been organized around the presence of a child. The soft geography of toys distributed across the floor. The mobile hanging above a playmat in the corner, the small shoes near the door that were barely larger than his palm. Renee was standing near the window with Hannah against her hip, the baby awake and alert, wearing a yellow outfit that made her look, Minjun thought, like a small and serious patch of sunlight. Renee looked at him. She did not speak. She was, he understood, giving him the moment. Not as a gift, but as a test. Or perhaps not a test, but simply the reality of it, which was that this was what he had asked for, and now it was here, and what happened next was on him. He crossed the room. He stopped a few feet from them. He looked at Hannah. Hannah looked at him. And then, with the absolute authority of a person who has not yet learned to make decisions based on anything other than the truest available information, she reached out one small hand toward his face. He let her touch his cheek. Her fingers were warm. She examined him with the patient focus of a scientist encountering a new specimen. And then she looked up at Renee, checking the way infants check, orienting herself against the person she trusts most. And Renee looked back at her and said, very quietly, "It's okay." Hannah looked back at Minjun. She made a small sound that was not quite a word, and not quite not a word. And then she did the thing that undid him completely, the thing that no amount of preparation could have prepared him for. She smiled. Not the reflex smile of a baby startled into happiness, but a deliberate one. The smile of a person who has decided, with whatever small and powerful intelligence she possessed, that the face in front of her is one she is willing to accept. Minjun Park, who had not cried since he was 14 years old and had scraped his knee badly enough to warrant tears, and had been taught instead to feel it and put it somewhere and move, did not put it somewhere this time. He felt it. He let it stay. He stood in Renee Caldwell's warm apartment with his daughter's hand against his cheek, and his eyes full of something that had been waiting, he understood now, for longer than 6 months. That had been waiting, perhaps, since he was 14 and had learned the wrong lesson from his father's ruin, and had spent 22 years building an empire on the foundation of that lesson, without ever questioning whether the foundation was sound. It was not sound. He knew this now. He knew it the way you know things that have been proven not by argument, but by consequence. The slow and irrefutable proof of what happens when a principle is wrong, and you follow it anyway. And the following costs you everything that was real. Renee watched him. She did not look away. She was, he understood, witnessing this deliberately. Not to be cruel, and not to be kind, but because she believed that a person should have to stand fully inside the truth of what they had done, and what it had cost, and what it might yet become, without the mercy of being looked away from. She had always believed this. It was one of the things he had loved about her, back when he had been allowing himself to love things. And he understood now that it had not changed, that she was still that person, that the 6 months had not altered the essential architecture of who she was, had perhaps reinforced it, added load-bearing elements, made it more fully itself. And that this, too, was something he had lost and could not simply reclaim but might, with sufficient patience and honesty and time, be permitted to witness from nearby. That was what he had. Nearby. Sunday. 1 hour. His mother's painting on a wall in an office above a bistro. A test result on a portal. A geneticist note about revised language that had arrived too late to prevent the damage, and in time, just barely, to begin naming it. And Hannah with her hand against his cheek, and his eyes and her mother's steadiness, and the particular smile of a person who has not yet learned to protect herself from the world, and is therefore able to receive it fully, without the elaborate architecture of defense that adults spend their lives constructing and dismantling and reconstructing, and that in the end, he was beginning to understand, never quite keeps out the things that matter. When the hour was over, he stood at the door. Renee's mother was in the kitchen. Renee stood in the hallway with Hannah on her hip, and the expression on her face was the one he had seen in the hospital corridor. Not warm, not cold. The expression of someone who has made a decision they are not certain about and has made it anyway. "Same time next Sunday?" he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then, "Same time next Sunday." He nodded. He looked at Hannah one more time. Those eyes, calm and alert and entirely themselves, neither his nor Renee's, but something new, something that had not existed in the world before the two of them had found each other in a conference room and stayed for 3 hours over coffee, and slowly, without either of them intending it, become necessary to each other. Something that deserved a father who had learned, finally, that the bravest thing a person can do is not to control what they feel, but to stand inside it fully, without putting it somewhere, and let it change them. He walked out into the Sunday morning. The light was different now than it had been on that gray Saturday. Clearer, more committed, the particular brightness of a day that has decided what it is. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment before getting in his car. He did not feel it and put it somewhere. He just felt it. And then slowly, he moved. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever had someone look at you, someone who claimed to love you, and choose their own fear over the truth you deserved to hear? Have you ever had to protect your dignity alone, carrying something heavy, while the person who should have stood beside you let their pride make the decision for both of you? And if you have ever been given the choice between holding on to your anger, which was earned, which was real, or opening a door, not for them, but for someone who needed you to, which one did you choose? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, truth, and redemption, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel.